Hello and welcome to Sounds Strategic, the podcast of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am Antônio Sampaio and I am delighted to welcome today two of my colleagues at the Conflict, Security and Development Program to talk about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic in countries facing armed conflict, as well as the implications for international peacebuilding efforts. So Virginia Comolli is the head of the Conflict, Security and Development Program, and Eleanor Beevor is research associate at the program and also has the dubious honor of being my roommate in Arundel House back when the world was a simpler and pandemic-free place. The coronavirus crisis has made governments and media turn introspective, looking after their own for understandable reasons. But for many countries facing not only armed conflict but also very weak and under-resourced institutions, the pandemic means potential increase in violence, unrest, food insecurity, and desperately needed international aid. But it may also present some opportunities. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, for instance, has called for a global ceasefire to facilitate humanitarian responses. Virginia, let me start with you because you've just come out of the editing process for the annual Armed Conflict Survey. There are currently 33 armed conflicts being followed in the book that we publish every year. What are the main trends that you see in some of the armed conflicts that you monitor that have been brought about by COVID since the publication has gone to press?
Hi, hello everyone. Yes, the book has recently gone to press, and we've spent months and months studying, analyzing the 33 situation of our conflict currently ongoing in the world. One thing that we spend a lot of time focusing on is understanding the behaviors and dynamics of the many conflict parties that are involved in conflict, both state, multinational organization, non-state actors. They paint a very complex situation. They have multiple agendas, competing agendas that are driven by political, economic, religious, ethnic, you name it, motivations. And this is already, as I said, a very complex situation. And we are now monitoring very closely what is happening with the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, which adds an additional layer of complication to situations that are already very, very fragile. We were particularly concerned when the World Health Organization recently issued a warning that Africa could be the next epicenter of the pandemic. Of the 33 conflicts that we monitor, 12 are actually taking place on the African continent, 10 in Sub-Saharan Africa and 2 in North Africa. So over a third of the conflicts are on the continent. And although at the moment the contagion has been fairly limited, as of the 28th of April, the African Union had reported just over 33,000 cases and 1,467 deaths. Although those numbers are fairly low in comparison to other regions in the world, there is a fear that things can escalate and can escalate quite rapidly. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has even warned that 300,000 people could actually die across the continent, and has indeed called for a $1 billion safety net for the continent in order to ease the situation, and has even asked for the halting on external debt payments to support African countries in their fight against the pandemic. So far, we've seen that most cases have focused or have been recorded in African capitals, but slowly they are moving elsewhere in areas that are actually affected by conflict. And we've seen that recently in Nigeria and in Cameroon. Only in mid-late April, we've seen cases of COVID-19 contagion reported in Borno State, which is the epicenter of the conflict with Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria. The situation, of course, in many African countries is one already of fragility. In addition to situations of conflict, we see a large proportion of the population, around 60% of urban dwellers, living in overcrowded slums, where hygienic conditions are very precarious, where many people who don't have access to clean water, and the health infrastructure often is very frail and already made even weaker by conflict. One of the conflicts that we've already seen increase in activities is the conflict across the Sahel and Burkina Faso in particular. And the health infrastructure has been severely impacted by ongoing violent conflict there, and already 1.5 million people have lost access to health care since 2019 because of the violence. So you can only imagine our concern where these people who already are struggling as it is because of infrastructural fragility, because of conflict, now also facing the pandemic, which is multiple also secondary effects, which for instance could include the spike in food prices that results from the closure of borders, which have been introduced by a number of countries in order to limit movement of people. And also, I think what is also important to remember is that one of the lessons that we can learn from the response in a number of Western countries, for instance in the United Kingdom, it really is the importance of a whole of government, but really a whole of society approach to the pandemic, to response to the pandemic. Well, areas of conflict are not really conducive to coordination or collaboration among different partners within government and within society, and this really creates further hinders the fight against the pandemic.
And one of the lines of support that many of these governments rely on to respond to humanitarian, societal, violent dynamics of these armed conflicts is the international system, multinational organizations, regional organizations, such as the United Nations. You've cited the African Union. And in this time of coronavirus, one of the interesting discussions that I've followed is how the nation state is being reinforced, the role of the states in society, etc., and that one of the potential negative implications is reduced international cooperation. How are you seeing the international organizations, multinational efforts, Virginia, on this coronavirus crisis? For instance, how is the United Nations coping with the crisis?
Yes, well, across a number of conflicts or conflict areas, of course, as you know, the United Nations play a very important role, and they currently have 13 missions across conflicts in the world, many of which are actually based in Africa. Normally, peacekeepers would be supporting local efforts in preventing the spread of a disease, and also helping with the support and coordination in terms of the logistic and communication and outreach when a disease, a pandemic is ongoing. So the peacekeepers would actually play that role normally. However, what we have seen, given the seriousness of the situation, is that in early April, the United Nations announced that it was suspending rotations of all uniformed personnel until the end of June, which means that troops who are currently based in African deployments will not be able to rotate, and new deployments will not take place for the foreseeable future. Of course, these are necessary measures. There are efforts across the whole world to limit international travel, and we know how that is important, and this is particularly sensitive issues for the United Nations because in 2016, the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon apologized for the role that UN troops had in the 2010 cholera crisis in Haiti. And that was basically the result of, well, at least it was partly the result of a deployment of Nepalese contingents and also poor sanitations in their barracks in Haiti. So the UN is very sensitive when it comes to these issues. But we've also seen how some countries, such as South Korea, have withdrawn peacekeepers, for instance, from UNMISS, which is the United Nations mission to South Sudan. This decision predated the UN announcement to suspend all rotations. But the repatriation of some troops also means that that those who are left in the field are actually facing increased challenges because of shortage of staff. Also, for those peacekeepers who are on the ground, there are a number of limitations to their ability to implement their mandate. For instance, in the Central African Republic, MINUSCA, which is a 14,000 strong mission that is aimed at protecting civilians across the country, is facing great limitations because they're unable to move across the country owing to a suspension of internal travel. So their ability to deliver what they are there to deliver has been greatly reduced, and this is likely to have impact on security as a whole. And finally, also, let's not forget the suspension of rotations means very long deployments for those who are already on the ground, and that has an impact on their physical and mental health, and which of course in turn can have an impact on their performance and the effectiveness of the mission as a whole. So there are a number of challenges there, of course. And also one important point to raise is money. The United Nations is now looking to raise about $2 billion around the world so that it can deal with the pandemic and its consequences without having a negative impact on humanitarian operations that are not actually related to the pandemic crisis, but that unfortunately, and in spite of the call for a global ceasefire by Secretary General Guterres, have not actually been put on hold, and they're actually continuing in many countries.
And on that call for a global ceasefire, Nella, do you think that, given your understanding of how non-state armed groups work and think, do you think this call has any chance of having a meaningful impact on reducing violence? And further, more broadly, how are armed groups in your area of study, which is Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, how are non-state armed groups responding to the coronavirus? I myself have seen some evidence from Rio that gangs have been imposing lockdown in the areas they control, which is remarkably remarkably aware of the scientific advice. So how are armed groups in more fragile settings in Sub-Saharan Africa coping with that?
Thanks, Antonio. Yeah, it's been extremely interesting seeing the divergent approaches of different armed groups around the world. And I think it was very difficult to know what to expect at the start of the pandemic. And certainly the reality has been different to a few of my expectations. So, for example, when Secretary General Guterres called for that global ceasefire, I don't know about you, but my expectations for responses to it were pretty low. And it's true that responses to it have been quite modest, but certainly from the non-state group side, there have been some interesting reactions. So, for instance, there were a few conflicts where this call for a ceasefire kind of bolstered existing ceasefires or plans for ceasefire anyways. So, for example, Yemen and Afghanistan kind of fell into this bracket, but were ultimately, these were slightly disappointing cases, since the conflict parties spoke enthusiastically about a COVID-19 ceasefire but didn't really live up to the commitments. The ceasefire was initially politically convenient signalling, but violations of that ceasefire could also be very easily blamed on enemy aggression, and in the end it didn't happen. That said, there were some other more encouraging examples. So, for instance, one of the factions of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North, the El Hilu faction, committed to extending its pre-existing ceasefire on the back of Secretary General's call for a ceasefire. We've also seen commitments by insurgents in the Philippines and in Thailand. And one of Cameroon's rebel groups, the South Cameroon Defence Forces, has also committed to respecting it. Now, it's easy to see that some groups do stand to gain from committing to that ceasefire publicly. The Cameroon example is quite a good one. The South Cameroon Defence Forces are one of the smaller groups, but it has received a great deal more attention as a result of this declaration. That said, I don't think we should rule out more altruistic or public health-minded thinking in non-state armed groups either. So in a nutshell, I think that the global ceasefire goes to show that it never hurts to ask. You might not get much, and there will inevitably be mixed motives driving decisions to sign on to a ceasefire for however long, but that doesn't invalidate the efforts to engage these groups or any results that they may achieve. Now, some of the more major armed groups, and particularly those with aspirations for statehood, have taken on bigger roles in fighting the virus. So the Taliban in Afghanistan, for instance, has been very active creating public awareness campaigns, both through visits to rural areas and through distributing material on its WhatsApp channels. It's posted videos of members handing out masks and soap to civilians, and it's promised to cooperate with humanitarian aid groups responding to the virus. However, some other state-aspiring groups have taken much more concerning positions as far as tackling the virus is concerned. So to go back to Africa, Al-Shabaab released a recorded statement in the evening of April 27th, so last night. It was a sound file of its spokesman, Sheikh Ali Mohammed Raga, with a message saying that COVID-19 was a punishment for disbelievers, but particularly the US, China and the EU for their war against Islam. He told Muslims to pray for protection, and this seems to be their fixed position. They had said something similar at the beginning of the pandemic. I was certainly hoping to see an evolution of their position as the severity of the threat became clearer, but this most recent messages suggest sadly not. And this has some very scary implications for Somalia and for the region more broadly. So as of today, Somalia has 480 cases with 23 dead. Most of those cases are in the Benadir region, which contains the capital Mogadishu. And while this is where the majority of healthcare facilities are, that's not necessarily comforting given the numerous urban displacement camps within the city where social distancing will be more or less impossible, and where delivering any kind of healthcare would be extremely difficult given the presence of Al-Shabaab in those camps. And I guess there's a broader point to be made from Al-Shabaab's reaction, which is that religion is going to play an interesting role in many conflicts during the pandemic. These roles will be both good and bad, so most countries' major religious institutions have been involved in, for instance, raising public awareness and helping people affected by the virus. But it's also produced some more problematic reactions. All religions struggle with the question of where God's will ends and human agency begins. but religious fundamentalists who see themselves as God's chosen side and all others as the enemy might interpret the pandemic in different ways. For instance, the Boko Haram leader Abu Bakr Shekau has said, "We have the anti-coronavirus, it is the Allah we worship," so I don't think we can expect him to take the risk seriously anytime soon. We have seen some more mixed reactions from Al-Qaeda and from ISIS. So for instance, Al-Qaeda said that those among them who are killed by the virus will be martyrs, but it's also still encouraging hand washing in its messaging. ISIS has also had a bit of a mixed reaction. It initially celebrated in its messaging that this disease had been sent to punish their enemies, but this has given way to more cautious messages, including newsletters which give guides to how to protect yourself from the virus, and telling their followers not to travel to Europe, although those followers who are already in Europe should do their best to attack. Now, one of the slightly scarier messages in there was an opinion piece in their weekly newsletter that implied that the best defense against the virus was jihad. It's going to be hard to say how widespread this view is, but I think one thing that's going to be important to watch as far as jihadist groups goes is how they will react during Ramadan. So many jihadist groups view Ramadan as the most important month in which to deliver attacks. This view is very controversial in Islamic theology, but the jihadists have several reasons for it. That's why in a lot of conflicts we see spikes in the number of attacks during Ramadan, and especially in complex wave spectacular attacks. And so far there isn't anything to suggest that their violence is decreasing in response to COVID-19, but an analysis of the number of attacks at the end of Ramadan will be quite an interesting reference point for that.
So, Nella, interesting that you mentioned jihadist organizations and particularly Al-Shabaab, because my next question was going to be precisely on that. So whereas many actually non-state armed groups have shown some proactive measures against coronavirus and implementing social distancing, there are also some pretty negative and dark precedents for armed groups in situations of crisis. So I'm thinking precisely here of the famine in Somalia in 2011, when Al-Shabaab denied that there was any problem in the areas it controlled in southern Somalia and banned Western aid organizations, which led to huge loss of life. I think there are some estimates of close to 5% of the population in Lower Shabelle region dying of famine. So do you think that this has anything to do with the character of these organizations, how they are, their organization, or the motivations that they fight for, or the worldview? And more generally, do you think this is more about the skepticism towards humanitarian responses rather than just not being able to or not being willing to do anything at all?
I think it's probably a combination of several of those factors. There has always been a concerted effort at the heart of Al-Shabaab to distance the Somali population that it controls in central and southern Somalia from the central government and from international responses. To give you an example, one of their most common refrains to the population, to the people under their control, is that the Somali government has a very large number of people from the diaspora in senior positions, and this has created quite a lot of tension with ordinary Somalis who see them as a kind of a more privileged class and who are unjustifiably getting more positions as a result. Al-Shabaab has always played on that, and it's tried to insinuate that that the diaspora government is effectively a colonization effort by Western countries. And I think similarly it's got a history of trying to paint aid groups in the same light. And yeah, I think the comparison with the famine is certainly an apt one for now. I hope that perhaps as cases grow in Somalia, Al-Shabaab will have to be a little bit more receptive to popular opinion if that moves in favor of stronger measures. Right now, attempts at a lockdown in Somalia have been met with a very mixed response, but perhaps public support for one will grow as the severity of the virus makes itself clear.
So, Virginia, when we look at the governments in conflict-affected countries, obviously they face weaker, or they have weaker political institutions. They have long-standing issues with providing public services. Has this diminished or weaker position of political systems and governments in conflict affected regions impacted their capacity to implement quarantine, to implement measures to be respected or trusted by their populations? So, how are national governments faring in conflict affected regions in this pandemic?
Well, different governments have introduced different restrictive measures from curfews. They've been introducing bans of travel across state borders. Of course, bans on international travel, the need to wear face masks, etc. But it's also interesting what Eleanor was discussing in terms of people's perception and how in some countries and among certain communities the broader population, or at least sections of the population, don't actually believe that COVID-19 is a real threat. It's not something that will eventually affect them. Of course, this has then an impact on the government's ability to effectively implement those measures, such as social distancing, which, for one, they're already very difficult to implement to begin with, given the very crowded conditions many people across some of this region live in. And also because we have to also bear in mind that there are different ways of life. For instance, how do you enforce lockdowns among nomadic tribes? So it's very hard to develop a strategy for social isolation, for instance, that is a one-size-fits-all, because you will need to account for these different differences among different communities, and indeed there is also an element of mistrust among the population when it comes to the government and also of government measures. I was reading very recently some interviews conducted among some Central African Republic citizens, and many were thinking that, well, COVID-19 is not a real thing, and is basically just a way that the government is or is a ploy used by the government to extort money out of the World Health Organization, and they won't be a victim of this pandemic. So there is a whole issue around education and messaging, which already is made difficult by the existence of violent groups such as Al-Shabaab that Nella mentioned, that are already sending out this messaging that the pandemic is a punishment, and it will basically only affect certain sections of the population. So already there is that the governments need to counter, in addition to other challenges. One thing that is very concerning, and we've seen a number of cases across Africa, is the misuse of force on the part of certain governments. So governments of Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, South Africa, and others have been heavily criticized by the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner for abusing their powers, imposing very restrictive measures that are enforced through large-scale detentions, through shootings, and through truly unlawful behavior. Apparently, over 17,000 people in South Africa have been arrested as a result of COVID-19 related restrictions that were not apparently followed by those citizens. Similar in Kenya, a number of human rights organizations have been calling for these measures to be lifted, or at least to be implemented in a way that is more in line with human rights. So the responses have been mixed, and really have highlighted the challenges that many governments have. Some they are in a way self-made, because when governments implement very heavy-handed measures, that usually backfires. And others have to do with issues of education, messaging, and also, of course, when these situations unfold against a background or backdrop of conflict, it means that there are parts of a territory that are actually outside the control of the nation state. And that's where non-state armed groups have been playing a greater role than the state itself.
So as we look forward, and knowing that there are so many complications and challenges facing conflict-affected countries, but one area in particular that I've been thinking about is the issue of food security, with people queuing up for food even in the streets here in the developed world, where we are in the United Kingdom. How do you think, both of you, food systems would cope, particularly in Africa, where many countries depend on food imports?
I can start by having a go at that. It is an extremely difficult question. I think it's going to depend on a number of things. Looking at East Africa and Somalia in particular, where food security was already an extremely acute problem, and particularly with the recent influx of locust swarms that have destroyed massive amounts of the food stocks that were supposed to be available. The food security arena is facing multiple threats at this point. I think one of the things that's going to affect this a great deal is how humanitarian groups are able to operate in the context of coronavirus, and there are sort of several things that have concerned me. The first of them is, as Virginia pointed out, there is an unfortunate history of international presences and aid organisations bringing diseases into the countries that they're trying to help, with Haiti in 2010 being the best known case. But for example, in early April, South Sudan saw a huge backlash against foreign aid deliverers in general, but the UN in particular, after 4 UN staff were diagnosed with coronavirus, and they were the first people in the country to be diagnosed. Now, we can't be certain that they were the ones who brought coronavirus into the country, but it's certainly possible. And this triggered a lot of social media posts threatening UN staff with attack and with death. And the government responded by sending soldiers to surround UN bases and not letting them leave, but also telling people in nearby refugee camps that they might be affected. They might be now infected as a result. So there's going to be a serious challenge of trust between international efforts, including around food security and around local populations, not unreasonably. And all these organisations are going to have to walk an extremely difficult line between deciding whether they take risks or try and deliver their goods in various different ways. And the other thing that I think is not entirely clear at the moment, but important to bear in mind, is possible restrictions on where aid can be delivered. So, for instance, a lot of humanitarian groups have been discouraged from distributing aid in territories controlled by non-state groups, but particularly those that have been designated as terrorist organisations, because depending on which body of law you're looking at, it is illegal and a potentially criminal offence to supply material, to supply any material goods to terrorist organisations. Now, humanitarians should, in theory, have the independence to distribute aid where it's needed. That said, it has been a factor that has limited humanitarian delivery in various conflict zones, and this, I think, the pandemic is the best possible example of why that's a very dangerous reality. That without responses wherever there are cases present, this pandemic isn't going to be stopped.
Thanks. Just quickly before we go, Virginia, do you see a heightened risk of riots, political unrest following the lockdown? Or, of course, during the lockdown, presumably it's harder to do riots, but do you see the potential for backlash against governments when the economic bill for the pandemic comes?
Oh, absolutely. I think we've already seen instances of people protesting and rioting on the streets. We have seen those in Nigeria, people who are afraid that these social distancing and travel bans measures will have an impact on their livelihood. So we've seen a number of those. I think we are likely to see more. And as I'm thinking also at the experience with the Ebola crisis in West Africa a few years back, where we even in that context we saw a number of social protests. We also saw similar things to what Nella was describing. So there's perhaps attacks against health workers or humanitarian actors. There's perception that they might actually be there to do something that is detrimental to the population, and those things all led to, well, in many cases led to social unrest. So I think we are likely to see to see more of that. One final thing that I'd like to also add is that although many reports paint a possibly very bleak future situation for Africa vis-a-vis the COVID-19 pandemic, we don't have sufficient data because the numbers remain quite low. It doesn't mean that they can't increase, but on both sides of the argument, i.e., whether it's going to be Africa is going to be the next hotspot, or whether actually the numbers are likely to remain low. I think on both sides of the argument, the evidence that we currently have is still limited to make a final assessment.
Yeah, that's a good point. We are dealing with the information and data that is available now and trying to make some forecasts, but it is a very fluid situation. Thank you very much, Virginia Comolli and Eleanor Beevor from the Conflict, Security and Development Program, my colleagues at the IISS. And please subscribe to Sound Strategic for more in-depth discussions. We're doing a series of programs on the impacts of the coronavirus around the world. And to keep up to date with the latest trends in international security and armed conflicts, please follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. See you next time.